The Prisoner of Zenda, Chapter 1. I was eating breakfast in the dining room of my brother's house one sunny morning, thinking about what I would do that week when my brother's wife Rose came into the room. "Rudolph, you're 29 years old," she said. "Are you ever going to do anything useful?" "Rose," I answered, putting down my egg spoon, "why should I do anything? I have nearly enough money to do anything I want." No one has ever quite enough money to do that, of course. "And I enjoy an important position in society. My brother's Lord Burlesdon, and you are a countess. But you've done nothing except be lazy? It's true. I'm a member of the Rasendale family, and our family don't need to do things." This annoyed Rose because her family were rich but less important than the Rasendales. At this moment my brother Lord Burlesdon, who we were happy to simply call Robert, came into the room. "Robert, I'm so happy you're back," cried Rose. "What's the matter, my dear?" Robert asked her. "She's angry because she thinks I don't do anything," I explained to my brother. At this point I should explain that I had not been lazy all my life. I had studied hard and learned a lot when I was at a German school and German university. I spoke German as well as I spoke English, and I also knew how to speak French, Italian, and Spanish. I was good with a gun and a strong swordsman. I was also very good at riding a horse. "It's not just your red hair that makes you different from your brother," said Rose. "He also realizes his position in society has responsibilities. You only see opportunities in yours." "To a man like me, opportunities are responsibilities," I explained. "Good, because I have some news for you," said Rose. "Sir Jacob Borrowdale tells me he'll offer you a real opportunity. He's going to be an ambassador in 6 months' time, and he says he's happy for you to work for him. I hope you'll take this job, Rudolph. My sister-in-law has a way of asking people to do things which is impossible to refuse. Moreover, I thought this job sounded quite interesting, so I said, if in 6 months' time I'm in a position to take this job, then I'll certainly say yes." "Oh, Rudolph, how good of you," said Rose. "Where will he be working?" I asked. "Sir Jacob doesn't know which country it will be, but he's sure it will be a good embassy." "For you, I'll do it, even if it's a terrible embassy," I replied. Now, I had made my promise to Rose, but there were still 6 months to go before the job would start, and I began to think about what I could do in this time. I decided that I would visit Ruritania, a small country in Middle Europe. My family have always had an interest in that country, because in 1733, Countess Amelia Rasendale married a member of the Ruritanian royal family, the Elfbergs. In fact, my brother has paintings of her and her descendants on his walls. Many of them have the same red hair and straight noses as the Elfbergs. I'm the latest one to have the appearance of the Ruritanian royal family. My decision was helped a few days later when I read in the Times newspaper that Rudolph V was to become the King of Ruritania in the next 3 weeks, and that amazing celebrations were planned for this joyous occasion. I thought how fantastic it would be to see such an event and began to prepare for my journey. I do not like to tell people where I go on my travels, so I told Rose that I was going walking in the Alps. I did not want her to think I was being lazy either, so I told her I was going to write a book about social problems in the country. "You're going to write a book? That would be such a good thing to do, wouldn't it, Robert?" said Rose. "Yes, indeed. Writing a book's the best way to get into politics," agreed Robert. "And he should know, as he has written many books himself." "You're right," I said to them both. However, I had no plan to really write a book, which shows how little we know about the future, because here I am now, writing a book, as I had promised to do, even if the book has nothing to do with the social problems in the Alps. But let me begin near the start of my journey to Ruritania. My Uncle William always said that no man should ever pass through Paris without spending 24 hours in the city, so I took his advice and booked a night at the Continental Hotel. As soon as I had checked in, I called on some old friends that I knew in the French capital, George Featherly, who worked at the embassy, and Bertrand, who was now a famous journalist in the city. That evening we all ate in a restaurant, and they told me all about the latest exciting events in Paris. "We've had quite a few important people visiting the city recently," said Bertram. "Anyone I'd know?" I asked. "Well, I met Antoinette de Mauban today," Bertram replied. "You've probably heard of her. She's a lady who's well known for her wealth and ambition, but she's leaving Paris today. We don't know where she's going next. So why did she come to Paris? I asked. She was a guest of Duke Strilslow, said George. I met him at the embassy yesterday. He's the half-brother of the King of Ruritania. People say he was his father's favourite son. He's gone back for the coronation, although I don't think he'll enjoy it very much because he probably wishes he were the king. I don't think he likes being only a duke. I hear he's a clever man, though, said Bertram. He's extremely clever, I'd say, agreed George. The next day, George came with me to the station, and I bought a ticket to my next stop, Dresden. I did not tell him that I was going to Ruritania. If I had, the news would have gone immediately to Bertram, and then it would have been in all the newspapers within days. Just as I was about to get on the train, George suddenly smiled and walked away to talk to a beautiful, tall, and fashionably dressed woman of about 30 who was standing at the ticket office with two younger women. I thought these must be her servants. You have an important person to travel with, George told me, when he returned a few minutes later. That's Antoinette de Bourbon, and she's also going to Dresden. Paris was soon behind me. It was a long and boring journey, and I wondered if I would see Antoinette de Bourbon in a dining car when I ate in the train that evening, or perhaps at breakfast in the next morning. However, I did not see the lady again until the following day, when both she and I got on the next train from Dresden to Ruritania. She was further up the train, however, and did not see me. A few hours later, the train arrived at Ruritanian border, where we stopped so the guards could check our passports. I was surprised when the guards stared at me and my passport for some time before letting me into the country. Once in Ruritania, I bought a newspaper and read that the king's coronation was to be in 2 days' time, which was much earlier than I had thought. The newspaper described the excitement in the country, and in particular the capital city, Strelsau, where it said all the hotels were full with people who wanted to see the event. On reading this, I decided it would be better to stop at Zenda, a small town 80 kilometres from the capital, and about 10 kilometres from the border. Here I could walk in the hills and see the town's famous castle. Then I could take the train for the day to Strelsau to see the coronation. As I got off the train at Zenda, I saw Antoinette de Bourbon, who remained on the train for its journey to the capital, but she did not look at me. I was welcomed at the inn in Zenda by an old woman who ran it with her 2 daughters. She said she was not very interested in what happened in the capital, but she loved the Duke of Strelsau, who she called Duke Michael. He was the man who was responsible for the land around Zenda and its castle. In fact, the hotel owner said she wished the Duke was the new king and not his brother. We all know Duke Michael, she explained. He always lived in Ruritania, and he cares about the people, so people like him. As for the king, well, he's almost a stranger. He's been abroad for most of his life, and not many people even know what he looks like. Now the king's staying in a hunting lodge in the forest, very near to Zenda. From there he'll travel to the capital for his coronation. I was interested to hear this, and decided I would walk in the forest the next day so that I might see him. I wish he'd stayed in the forest, continued the woman. People say he only likes hunting and good food. He should let the Duke become our king, and there are many others who think the same. Well, I don't like Duke Michael, said her older daughter. They say the king has red hair just like you. Many men have red hair like me, I laughed. How do you know the king has red hair? The old woman asked her daughter. Johann, the duke's servant, told me, she explained. He'd seen the king at the hunting lodge. But why is the king here? If it's the duke's land, I asked. The duke invited him, sir, explained the old lady. The duke in Strelsau preparing for the coronation, so they are good friends. I don't know if you can be good friends if you want the same thing. What do you mean? Duke Michael would like to be king too, I'm sure. Well, I said, I feel quite sorry for the duke, but it's right that the older brother becomes king. Who's talking of the duke? Said a deep voice from outside the door. We have a guest, Johann, called the old lady, as a man entered the room. When he saw me, he took off his hat and stepped back in surprise, as though he had seen something amazing. What's the matter, Johann? Asked the old lady. This gentleman's come to our country to see the coronation. It's the red hair, said one of the daughters. We don't often see it in our country, unless you're part of the king's family, the Elfbergs. Many of them have red hair. The man continued to stare at me, but said, Good evening, sir. I'm sorry I didn't expect to see any new guests here. Don't worry, I said. It's late, and time I went to bed. I wish you all a good night. Thank you, ladies, for our conversation. I stood up to go to my room when Johann suddenly said, Sir, have you ever seen our king? No, I've never seen him, but I hope to do so on Wednesday at the coronation. Johann said no more, but I felt his eyes on me as I walked up the stairs. The next morning, Johann seemed much more relaxed. When he heard that I was going to Strelsau, he said I could stay at his sister's house. She was married to a wealthy trader, and she had invited him to stay with them for the coronation, but he wasn't able to go. I was very happy to have this opportunity and accepted his offer. So he said he would contact his sister at once and tell her to expect me that day. I decided, however, that I still wanted to see the forest where the king was staying, so I first planned to walk for 16 kilometers through the forest to the next station along the line, where I could catch a train to the capital. I did not tell Johann about this plan, as I did not think it would be important if I arrived at his sister's later in the day, so I sent my luggage onto the station and said goodbye to the old lady and her daughters, and set off up to the hill towards the castle. After that, it was a short walk to get into the forest. Half an hour later, I reached the castle. It was very old but well built, with a moat all around it. Behind it was a large modern mansion, which was used by the Duke of Strelsau in his country home. The mansion was reached by a wide road, but the old castle could only be reached by drawbridge between it and the mansion. I was pleased to see that the Duke had such a well-defended house, even if he were not to become king. Soon I reached the dark forest, and I walked for about an hour, pleased that the tall trees gave me cool shade. Not much sun reached the ground through the many leaves. It was a beautiful place, and after a time I decided to rest by lying against one of the enormous trees. It was so quiet and peaceful in the forest that I soon fell into a deep sleep, forgetting all about the train I should have caught to Strelsau and my luggage that would be waiting at the station. I was just dreaming about living in the castle of Zenda when a voice woke me. Why, look at him, it's amazing! He looks just like the king! I opened up my eyes slowly and found two men looking at me. Both carried guns and were dressed for hunting. One of them was short but looked very tough, with light blue eyes, and he looked like a soldier. The other was younger, thin and of medium height, and he looked like a gentleman. I later found out that my guesses were both correct. The older man walked up to me and raised his hat to me politely, so I stood up. He's about the same height as the king too, he said. This is really extraordinary. What's your name, sir? Perhaps you can tell me what your names are first, I asked.
The Prisoner of Zenda, Chapter 2. It was a very strange feeling for me to be standing in a forest in the middle of Ruritania, in front of a person who looked exactly the same as me. For a few minutes, the future king of Ruritania and I stood looking at each other in silence. Then I bowed to him, and he finally spoke. Colonel? Fritz? Who is this gentleman? I was about to answer when Colonel Sapt stepped forward and spoke quietly to the king. As the colonel talked, the king listened patiently, staring at me now and then. While they were talking, I examined him carefully. He certainly looked very like me, although there were some differences. His mouth was perhaps less wide, and my face was a little thinner. But in most ways we were identical. Colonel Sapt stopped talking, and the king suddenly began to laugh loudly. Then he stepped up to me, still laughing, and said, "It's good to meet you, cousin. You must forgive me if I seem surprised, as it's not every day that you see your double." "I hope you're not angry," I said. "Whether I like it or not, you can't help looking like me." "No, I'll happily help you. Where are you traveling to?" "To Strelsau, sir, to the coronation." The king looked at the other two men and smiled. "What would my brother Michael think if he saw us two together?" he cried. "But, sir," said Fritz von Tarlenheim, "I don't think it would be a good idea for Mr. Rassendyll to visit Strelsau now." "Really?" "What do you think?" the king asked Colonel Sapt. "I agree. He mustn't go," said the old soldier. "Don't worry, sir. I understand the problem," I said. "I'll leave Ruritania today." "You don't need to go now," said the king. "Please, first you must eat with me tonight. You don't meet a new cousin every day." "Remember, sir, that we have an early start tomorrow," said Colonel Sapt. "We can still eat well," said the king, "and good food is more important than sleep. Now, Mr. Rassendyll, what's your first name?" "The same as yours," I answered, bowing again. "Come, then, Cousin Rudolph. I don't have a house here, but I'm staying in the place my brother Michael uses for hunting. It's not the palace that I'm used to, but it will do for a few days." So I walked with the king for half an hour through the forest, talking happily until we reached a small wooden hunting lodge between the trees. The king's personal servant came out to meet us. The other servant was the mother of Johann, the man who I had met earlier at the inn. "Is dinner ready yet, Joseph?" the king asked the servant. The servant said it was, and showed us into a dining room where a table had been laid out with generous amounts of food. After my walk, I was hungry, so I ate a lot, and the food was delicious. But I noticed that Colonel Sapt and Fritz von Tarlenheim did not want to eat too much because of the events the next day. "The colonel and I have to leave here at 6 tomorrow morning," Fritz explained. "We ride to Zenda and return with a guard of soldiers to take the king to the station." "It's very good of my brother to let me use his guards," said the king. "But, Rudolph, forget these two men. We don't need to get up so early, so eat more, cousin." We continued to eat, and Joseph continued to bring in more food. "The Duke said I was to give you this at the end of your meal," said the servant, putting some cakes in front of us. "Well done, Michael. He knows me well," said the king happily, and he ate the cakes hungrily, as if they were the first thing he had eaten all day. I ate one of the cakes, but I had really eaten enough, and when the king seemed to have finally finished eating, I asked to go to bed. That is all I remember of that evening. The next thing I remember, I woke up suddenly, covered in water. I looked up and saw Colonel Sapt standing in front of me, with Fritz von Tarlenheim next to him. "That wasn't funny," I said. when I realized the colonel had thrown water over me. Nothing else would wake you up. It's 5 o'clock, said Sapt. 5 o'clock? But it's early and... Rassendyll, said Fritz in a worried voice, you must come and look at this. He took my arm and led me to the next room. The king was lying on the floor. His face was red, and he was breathing heavily. We've been trying to wake him up for half an hour, but we can't, explained Fritz. I bent down and felt his pulse, which was very weak and slow. It must have been those cakes that he ate last night. Do you think he was poisoned? I asked. We don't know, said Sapt. We must get a doctor. There's no doctor for 15 kilometers, and even 1,000 doctors won't make him better today, said Fritz. But what about the coronation? I cried. We must tell the people of Ruritania that he's ill, said Fritz. If he's not crowned today, I don't think he'll ever be king, said Sapt. But why? I asked. The whole country's waiting for him today. Most of the army is waiting too, with Duke Michael leading it. They won't be happy, said Sapt. We must tell everyone what's happened and make the most of it, said Fritz, getting up to leave. Sapt stopped him. Do you think that he was poisoned? He asked me. Yes, I do, I answered. Then who did it? It must have been Duke Michael, Fritz said angrily. Yes, he did this so that his brother cannot be crowned, continued Sapt. You don't know what the Duke is like, do you, Rassendyll? If Rudolph doesn't become king, Duke Michael will take the crown. We all sat in silence while we thought about what we could do. Then Sapt suddenly stood up. I have an idea. It was lucky that we met you yesterday, he said excitedly, looking at me, because you can go to Struslau to be crowned. Me? That's impossible, I laughed. People would realize that I'm not the king. And don't forget that I'm English. It would be easy to forget that, said Fritz, because your German's perfect. And if we dress you in different clothes, no one will know. If you don't go to Strusau, Duke Michael will be king tonight, and the king will either be dead or in prison, said Sapt. I understand what you are saying, but the king would never forgive me if I... Our country needs this, cried Sapt. Standing up, I walked round the room in silence. The clock ticked 60 times, then 70, 80. I looked at the poor king lying on the floor and realized I had no choice. Sapt clearly read my expression, because he smiled even before I said quietly, Very well, I'll go. We won't wait for Michael's guards but leave for Strusau at once, said Sapt. We can hide the king in the cellar, so when the guards arrive, they'll think no one else here, said Sapt. What if they search the building? Asked Fritz. Joseph will say the hunting lodge is empty, said Sapt. This is our only chance. How will we get the king to Strusau? I asked. Tonight we sleep in the palace, said Sapt. As soon as we are alone in the king's bedroom, You and I will leave and come back here on our horses. Fritz can stay and guard the king's bedroom in the palace, and I will tell Joseph to get the king ready for the journey back. The king will then return to the palace with me in the dark. Meanwhile, you will ride as fast as you can to the border and try to leave the country before it's light. Do we all agree on this plan? I agree, I said. It's a good plan, said Fritz. Sapt and Fritz picked up the king and began to carry him out of the room. But we realized we were being watched by Johann's mother, who looked at us with a strange expression before walking off. I think she heard us, said Sapt. After we've moved the king, I'll speak to her. Meanwhile, Joseph began to dress me in some of the king's clothes. When Fritz returned, he looked at me and said, You know, I think we can do this. What happened to Johann's mother? I asked. She's locked in the cellar with the king, said Fritz. Joseph will let her out later, after Michael's gone. But I'm sure when they find that the king is not here, Michael will realize we know about his plan. Let's go, said Sapt, returning into the room. Is all safe here? Asked Fritz. No, nothing's safe anywhere, but we must do our best, answered Sapt. We were now all in uniforms and set off on horses. It was a cool morning, and Sapt immediately began to tell me the history of the king's life, of his family, likes, interests, weaknesses, friends, and servants. He told me how I should behave in the palace and said he would always be at my side to tell me who the people were that I met. Soon we reached the station. Fritz told the surprised-looking station guard that the king had changed his plans, and we got on the train to the capital. I looked at my watch, or I should say the king's watch, and asked Fritz if he thought Duke Michael had found the king. I hope not, said Fritz. After a short time, we passed the towers and buildings of the capital, and I could see we were near the station. How are you feeling? Asked Sapt. Nervous, I replied. I'm not made of stone, you know. You'll be fine, but we are an hour earlier than expected, so there'll be no one to meet us. We must send word to the palace. So meanwhile, I'll have some breakfast, I cried. The king is hungry. Sapt smiled at me, then took my hand. Let's hope we're all alive tonight. The train stopped, and I breathed deeply as we stepped out onto the station at Strelsau. A moment later, and everything was suddenly busy. Men ran up to us, then ran away again. Soldiers rode off on horses. Other men showed me to the station restaurant. As I ate my breakfast, I could hear music and people cheering, "God save the king!" in preparation for the coronation. God save both kings, said Sapt. When we left the restaurant, we saw that a group of soldiers had arrived to welcome us. It was led by a tall old man whose jacket was covered in medals. That is Marshal Strakinch, said Sapt, so that I knew who he was. A very important person in the army. The marshal greeted me and said he was sorry that the Duke could not meet me at the station, but that he would see me shortly. I answered as politely and formally as I could, and began to feel less nervous when no one seemed to realize that I was not the real king. But I saw that Fritz was still very nervous when he shook the marshal's hand. The soldiers led us out of the station, where we got onto horses that were waiting outside. I began to ride through the capital with the marshal on my right and Sapt on my left. As we were riding, I saw that the city was partly old and partly new. There were wide, modern streets where the rich people lived in big houses. These were the people who had always lived well under the king's father, and who support the new king because they knew that nothing would change. But behind the modern streets was a very different area that made up the old town. Here, thousands of people were crowded into tiny houses which were old and hot in the summer, freezing cold in the winter. These narrow streets were where the city's many poor people lived, and these people did not want things to stay the same. For that reason, they did not like the king and supported Duke Michael, who told them he wanted things to be different and gave them hope for a better future. I knew that this area would not be very safe for me, the king. We continued towards a great square where the palace stood. There were colored flags and colorful ribbons everywhere, and people lined the streets clapping and cheering. I waved to them as we passed, and people threw flowers down from balconies above me. One flower fell on my horse, so I picked it up and stuck it onto my coat. Seeing me do this, the marshal looked at me, but I could not tell from his expression whether he was happy or angry. Nevertheless, I smiled happily at the marshal. I have written happily, but that is really how I felt. The truth is, at the moment, I really believed that I was actually the king. I looked up and laughed, delighted to see so much color and so many happy faces. Then I looked again in surprise. There, on a balcony above me, was the proud smile of the traveler on the train, Antoinette de Mauban. She stared at me. Her expression changed. Surely she knew who I was. Surely she would call out, "That is not the real king."
Speak English like an American. Copyright 2003. All rights reserved. Lesson 1. Bob's Day at Work. Bob works as a manager in a furniture store. Peter, his boss, is not happy about sales. Bob's new advertising campaign hasn't helped. Peter decides to fire him.
Bob, I hate to break the news, but our sales were down again last month.
Down again, Peter?
Yeah, these days everybody's shopping at our competition, Honest Abe's furniture store.
But everything in there costs an arm and a leg.
That's true. They do charge top dollar.
And their salespeople are very strange. They really give me the creeps.
Well, they must be doing something right over there. Meanwhile, we're about to go belly up.
I'm sorry to hear that. I thought my new advertising campaign would save the day.
Let's face it, your advertising campaign was a real flop.
Well, then I'll go back to the drawing board.
It's too late for that. You're fired.
What? You're giving me the axe?
Yes, I've already found a new manager. She's as sharp as a tack.
Can't we even talk this over? After all, I've been working here for 10 years.
There's no point in arguing, Bob. I've already made up my mind.
Oh well, at least I won't have to put up with your nonsense anymore. Goodbye to you and goodbye to this dead-end job.
Please leave before I lose my temper.
Lesson 2. Bob returns home with bad news. Bob tells his wife Susan that he lost his job. Susan suggests that he start his own business.
What's the matter, dear?
Susan, I got canned today at work.
But Bob, you were Peter's right-hand man.
Yes, and he stabbed me in the back.
Keep your chin up. Maybe he'll change his mind and take you back.
When pigs fly, once he makes up his mind, he never changes it. Besides, I told him off.
Look on the bright side. You won't have to set eyes on Peter ever again.
Thank goodness for that.
Hang in there. I'm sure you won't be out of work for long.
In the meantime, we'll have to live from hand to mouth.
Don't get too stressed out, Bob. We'll make ends meet.
I can always get a job at McDonald's as a last resort.
I don't think they're hiring right now.
If worst comes to worst, we can sell our home and move into a tent.
Let's think big. Maybe you can start your own business.
Easier said than done.
Lesson 3. Ted's Day at School. Ted tells his parents he did poorly on his chemistry test. They tell him he needs to get serious and study more.
How was your day at school today, Ted?
Bad. I had a chemistry test and I blew it.
Maybe if you didn't cut class so often, you'd do better.
That's right, son. Stop slacking off and start hitting the books.
But I can't stand chemistry class. Besides, it's a lost cause. That class is way over my head.
You need to buckle down.
When I'm a famous musician, people won't give a hoot about my knowledge of atoms and molecules.
That's beside the point.
We know you have your heart set on going to New York University.
And you don't stand a chance of getting in there with such poor grades.
To write a paragraph, you have to know just what a paragraph is. To write a paragraph, you have to know just what a paragraph is. Choose a topic, add transitions, reason, detail, facts and evidence. Write a conclusion, and now you know what a paragraph is. To write a paragraph, you have to know just what a paragraph is.
There's a movie on TV tonight. Are you going to watch it?
No, I'm going to write some letters.
I heard that Lisa won some money. What's she going to do with it?
She's going to buy a new car.
This cheese looks awful. I'm not going to eat it. B.
What time are you meeting Amanda this evening?
I'm leaving tomorrow. I have my plane ticket.
The windows are dirty.
Yes, I know. I'm going to wash them later.
I've decided not to stay here any longer. Tomorrow I'm going to look for another place to live.
C. Look at those black clouds. It's going to rain.
I feel terrible. I think I'm going to be sick.
D. We were going to travel by train, but then we decided to drive instead.
Peter was going to take the exam, but he changed his mind.
I was just going to cross the street when somebody shouted, "Stop!"
I thought it was going to rain, but then the sun came out.
Unit 20. A.
Oh, I left the door open. I'll go and shut it.
What would you like to drink?
I'll have some orange juice, please.
Did you call Julie?
Oh, no, I forgot. I'll call her now.
I'll go and shut the door.
I'm a little hungry. I think I'll have something to eat.
I don't think I'll go out tonight. I'm too tired.
I can see you're busy, so I won't stay long.
B. I'm leaving on vacation next Saturday.
Are you working tomorrow?
C.
That bag looks heavy. I'll help you with it.
You know that book I lent you? Could I have it back if you're finished with it?
Of course. I'll give it to you this afternoon.
Thanks for lending me the money. I'll pay you back on Friday.
I'll tell anyone what happened. I promise.
Will you please be quiet? I'm trying to concentrate.
Will you shut the door, please?
I've tried to give her advice, but she won't listen.
The car won't start. I wonder what's wrong with it.
D.
Shall I open the window?
Where shall we have lunch?
Let's go to Marino's.
Should I open the window?
Where should we have lunch?